Hello, welcome to the second webinar in a series that's being run by Metis Partners on intellectual property in insolvency and distress situations. Today we're going to be talking about selling intellectual property assets, and we're going to do that with a bit of a spin on software asset sales, which have been very, I was going to say popular, that's probably the wrong word, but prevalent over the last 6 months to 12 months, certainly for us, I think, in the wider insolvency world. Today, I've got my colleague Morgan Fraser with me.
Hello.
Who has been carrying out a lot of these sales in relation to software assets, and she'll be talking you through the rump of the content in this seminar. So just a recap on who we are. We're Metis Partners. We're intellectual property specialists valuing and selling intellectual property. We work internationally. Most of our work comes from distress in the UK. Sorry, hang on, I think we're having a bit of a technical malfunction here. Hopefully that's better. We provide intellectual property advice from a commercial perspective rather than a legal perspective, and we have a growing multidisciplinary team. So what have we sold recently in this space in relation to software assets in particular? We've done quite a lot actually, as I said. And what is software? I suppose when we talk about software, we're not just talking about software-specific companies. There might be companies out there who have developed software within their business that supports their business that still has value. And the software industry covers a wide range of different market segments, including apps, e-commerce websites, software as a service, and the games industry. We've done quite a lot of each of these. A couple of examples to draw your attention to. We sold the assets from Gazoob, which was a children's and educational app, and also from a social media website called Blip Photo that had a tie-in with Polaroid, which was a bit like Instagram. We posted a photo a day, and there was a community of what we call blippers that we had to manage through the sale as we sold the IP assets. So what are we going to talk about in this webinar? We're going to recap very quickly on what we talked about last time. We're going to have a very quick poll, which is an innovation for us. We are going to talk about selling IP assets, selling software, and we're going to include a case study. We'll also talk about potential pitfalls, and we'll give you 5 key takeaways so that you can take something away from this webinar into your next case. So I'll hand over to Morgan to go through a quick recap of the IP assets in insolvency and also to take you through the content of the webinar.
So for those who weren't at the last webinar, and for some of those who were, we have a quick recap here of what intellectual property is and how to look for it in insolvency. So clearly, in most cases, there will be some intellectual property assets in a case, whether that be a brand or a trademark, if that's unregistered or registered. There might also be designs and patents. And coming on to the focus of today's webinar is software, as well as data, websites, and domain names. Many companies will now have at least a website and a domain name, as well as a brand and some trademarks. And then there are slightly less frequently trade secrets. There may be some copyright potentially in magazines or in the book publishing industry that you might have seen. And finally, there's organizational knowledge, which is a catch-all for information located on a server that could be of use to any potential purchaser picking up the assets and carrying on with the restructuring of a business or pulling the company in a different area altogether. So for more information on this, please see the previous webinar, and you can definitely ask us for the link at the end of the webinar. So now we're going to try to do a quick poll. So polls have got a bad name recently, but we thought it might be interesting to run a quick unscientific poll to show how much do you think the assets can sell for in insolvency. Now, the first person to get this right will get a prize. The prize is to be determined, but will be sent out after the webinar.
So magic 8 ball.
Oh, is it?
It's going to help them make their decisions with in their insolvency processes.
So we're going to take a recent example of Austin Reed and Country Casuals. The Austin Reed, and to give you a couple of pointers, the Austin Reed brand and Country Casuals were sold in May to Philip Day of Edinburgh Willow Mill. Now, the revenue for Austin Reed at January 2015, according to Companies House, was 44.4 million, and the revenue for Country Casuals was 34.5 million. So you have a quick minute to submit your guess. So hopefully this should launch and you might be able to see. So what's likely to have been sold? What do other people tend to think would go with retail brands? So normally in this type of scenario, we would expect some of the assets to be the trademarks associated, the data, the website, maybe with some software and some domains, as well as the goodwill and the brand. It's also likely to be the organisational knowledge, and organisational knowledge, although often overlooked, it can be really valuable to a purchaser, so they can pick it up and run with the assets. There is a bit of a perception that all goodwill is lost, and the government is guilty of this too, when a company enters into insolvency, and that's not the case. The answer here is not 0 and 0. So what are the answers and what have people gone for? So I think you've got another kind of half a minute to go for this. This is quite interesting. So there does appear to be a bit of a split coming up in the poll here. All right, so about 60% of you have voted. Well, people are getting in their votes now. Last couple of seconds. So overall, about 40% of you were right. It is 2.45 million and 512.5k according to Companies House. So the assets are likely to have been sold with other assets, I would note. So 3% of you thought it was 1.25 and 102. 31% of you thought it was 3.64 and 314.5, and 26% of you for 5.95 and 802.1. So 40% of you can give yourself a little round of applause. Now, selling IP assets is a bit like selling everything else. You can find out as much information as possible about the assets, including where the assets sit first. You can find hidden gems in IP assets, as I'm sure some of you will know, but it can take a little bit of time to uncover them, and they can be surrounded by or embedded in an array of other assets. But finding that one hidden gem and selling it with any complementary assets can equate to a much higher return. So in a very basic sense, what do we do when we sell IP assets? We gather information around them, we produce documentation, we market widely, we find buyers, we negotiate, and then hopefully we sell the assets to the highest bidder.
That's right, and I think what we try and do, Morgan, is we try and market as widely as possible, and we'll have specialist buyers of intellectual property assets and separate intellectual property assets. So we know a lot of domainers who will buy and sell domain names, so there might be a hidden gem in there, as we kind of covered in our last webinar. We know patent aggregators and non-practicing entities who will buy just simply patents from a case of yours without buying anything else, and obvious examples would be people who are just looking for distressed software assets who might be willing to take a bit of a punt on a piece of software that's not been fully developed yet.
So we're going to do a walkthrough of how IP assets are sold in insolvency using Amazon as an example to illustrate how this can be done with some key tips and tricks, as well as some wee pitfalls along the way. We've chosen to focus on software on this one, as most companies now have some form of software within their business. And we hope this will provide us with a way to discuss a number of issues in IP in insolvency. For this webinar, we've chosen Amazon. That's partly because Christmas shopping is on my mind, as I'm sure it's on the mind of many of you at the moment, and because Amazon reaches across quite a few different areas. So if Amazon were going through a restructuring or insolvency process, what would we be looking at to sell? We'd probably be looking at selling the Amazon brand as well as their trademark portfolio, both registered and potentially some unregistered rights there. The e-commerce functionality of their website, or in the case of Amazon, many websites, and the data that pertains to both suppliers and buyers on their site, as well as their trade secrets. So for instance, in the case of Amazon, the way that the pickers are allocated according to algorithm in the most efficient manner. So clearly these are just groupings of assets that Amazon might have, and any company might have one or two or even more of groupings of assets. And it's important to be able to put the assets within the right classes in order to try to showcase in the best possible manner the opportunity that exists for any purchasers. So one of the first things to note is that all the information that is possibly relevant needs to be gathered before you start marketing. One of the ways that you can think about marketing IP assets and thinking about gathering the information is thinking through a type of pre-mortem, which is thinking about something which might happen and might go wrong before it does. For example, when selling assets from companies involved in retail e-commerce, one of the key areas about which purchasers are concerned is the data. Is the data analytics? Has the data been cleansed? Is there a clean record of where that data comes from? It can greatly increase the price of assets if purchasers are provided with these types of answers in advance so that they can gain the greatest visibility on the asset before putting in an offer. Of course, once an offer has been received, you can always use it as leverage in order to increase the purchase price, because as purchasers receive further information on the data, they may increase their offer because they can see what type of data it is and how they would be able to most effectively use that within their commercialization strategy for the current IP assets or within their current business stream. So when we're thinking about software, what kind of information are we thinking about? One of the most important assets for Amazon will clearly be its e-commerce software. For this, it's important to know if they own their own software or if a developer owns it. What language is it written in? For example, at the moment, Ruby is quite simple and quite popular. When was the last time that the software was updated? Was it on a rolling basis, or are there iterations of the software? Are there currently known bugs that have a significant detrimental impact, or are they relying on one serious partner? Another important aspect to take into account, specifically when you're thinking about retail e-commerce, is a delivery mechanism for the goods. Is that achieved by an in-house delivery team, as it is in Amazon, or are they relying on another company to do this? With the other assets, such as trademarks, if the company does not own any registered trademarks, it might be worth looking into filing a trademark application to complement the other assets. This can increase the value of the brand, but it can also deter any nefarious purchasers from registering the trademark on their own and passing off any assets as theirs. So, what are you selling when you're selling a domain name? Most companies will have a domain name, and when selling, it's important to be aware of some of the potential pitfalls that are involved in domain names. For instance, always check that these are not about to run out if they're critical to a sale.
Yeah, and we've had some situations where that's caused a little bit of embarrassment for insolvency practitioners and can be a difficulty. One memorable one was an insolvency where the domain name lapsed, and we went back to check the domain name, and the domain had been unfortunately picked up by a Japanese adult entertainment site, and so that raised some pretty awkward questions when it came to buyers looking at the IP assets as a whole. Thankfully, we did manage to talk that one away and get a deal done, but certainly makes things a little bit more difficult if your domain has lapsed. So worth checking out first off and securing those.
So when you're thinking about selling the assets, you've gathered your information, produced marketing information, it's time to think about who you want to sell the assets to. In insolvency, clearly, it matters about cold hard cash and how much you're going to get for a return. And if you're thinking about interested parties, for instance with Amazon, those within the sector are perhaps the most likely to purchase. So perhaps in this instance, it would be eBay or Tesco Direct or Argos. But then also thinking slightly further away from the immediate circle of interested parties would be perhaps a Waterstones or a WH Smith who might be interested. Then there are those who are not in the sector currently, but who might be interested in getting into the sector. So, or they maybe want their trade secrets, like I mentioned the Pickers algorithm earlier. So people like Azos or Misguided or Boohoo or Very might be interested in the assets too. Of course, then it's all about providing further due diligence, negotiating your best offer with the purchaser, and going through legal completion. So once you've found a purchaser, it's helpful if completion is achieved as quickly as possible in order to minimise any ongoing liabilities, such as hosting fees for any website which could have been kept live during the administration process. When selling intellectual property assets from insolvency, it's not always easy to tell what's there, what you thought was there, and now what might be gone. Of course, all insolvency lawyers, and I know that there's a few on the call, so hello. All insolvency lawyers will mitigate the insolvency professional's risk. There's no warranties, there's no indemnities, there's no liabilities in the SPA. It can be difficult to know what exactly there is in the schedule. This is in stark contrast with the physical assets, which can be scheduled out, as a physical asset valuer can confirm exactly what's there. When thinking about a schedule for IP, it can also be helpful to start out with an all-encompassing definition rather than scheduling it out entirely. There are assets that can remain hidden for quite a while after the purchaser has gone through the completion process. That's the upside of being a purchaser in insolvency. If it's necessary to schedule certain of the assets, though, it can help to keep this as brief as possible so that the insolvency practitioner is not tied into providing assets that might not be there.
So one of the critical points is, I think, legal completion is to perhaps make the provisions on delivery as vague as possible from the insolvency practitioner's point of view, because you don't want to have to be on the hook for actually providing assets later down the road. So it's all a matter of negotiation, but we would always suggest that that's kept as vague as possible so that you're not having to deliver specific assets on specific dates in specific manners. So much better just to say, look, you get what you get, this is what we think there is, and leave it at that.
And I think to that point, I think, for example, in software, it could be that no one at the company's actually seen the source code for a few months. The director might be unsure about what version of the software is being held by the company. In addition, there could have been some annotations on the code or manuals to go with the code for developers that the director had commissioned but is unsure whether those were ever achieved. In these types of circumstances, provided the buyer is clearly aware of the risks, it might be better not to schedule out all of these assets to do with the software. In the best case, the purchaser gets an extra asset, but conversely, if it's not there and the software is of an older version, the purchaser is going to have to invest more money to develop the assets to an appropriate level in order to commercialise the opportunity. Finally, we would always advise getting a deposit when selling IP assets, as it can speed legal completion as parties are more invested in the outcome and know that they've already invested time and money in the assets, so they're more likely to complete. Hopefully, the buyer goes off into the sunset with their assets. So as in any assignment, there are a number of ways that there could be an issue in selling software from insolvency, but we've chosen a select few specifically to show what can go wrong. So for instance, how old is the code? Where is the code? Do you have direct control over it? Parties shouldn't really have access to the code before having fully purchased the assets. And more interestingly, actually, we have found that creative types do find it quite difficult to adapt to another developer's code. It can be hard for them to push forward with a deal if they're not confident that the code is written in exactly the same way as they might choose to write it. So this can be something that you have to take into account when negotiating. Commercial types may be more willing to take a punt on these types of things, but creatives might see issues with some parts of a code.
And that's right, and sometimes that's a little bit luck of the draw, because I know we've done a couple of jobs where the asset's been written in a certain language, and we have had serious interest, and then the interest has gone away because the language isn't the same and the infrastructure would have to be completely rebuilt to accommodate that new code. So it is unfortunately something to be taken seriously and try and find potential purchasers who are using the same coding language.
So now we're going to move on to a short case study. So MatchChat was a sale that was actually prior to insolvency. They were looking to gain greater access to distribution for websites. So to give you a little bit of a flavour of what the technology was, MatchChat was a leading fan engagement solution provider that had been developing and offering a suite of easy-to-use software tools relating to audience engagement and native advertising. They had achieved around 2 million page views per day at its peak, with around 50 to 60 million impressions a month. And there were around 30,000 registered users at the time of sale. The MatchChat brand, some of you might have used it, was widely recognised within the football, entertainment and media industries. And they were utilised by over 130 websites, including fan websites of a number of football clubs like Manchester United, Liverpool, West Ham, Newcastle, Chelsea and Arsenal. So although there was limited revenue, there was a decent return that we achieved on this sale, despite the lack of serious revenue. So what did we do? We ran through the process. We started with the gathering of the information in order to build value in the assets. We produced our marketing information to give the assets the best possible look at the market, and then we compiled a bespoke database of interested parties. So we sent it to a bespoke database, and then we also sent it to all of our contacts who buy intellectual property assets in insolvency, who have other contacts who are looking to pick up assets to complement their business strategies. So some tips and tricks that we came across along the way on this assignment in MatchChat, but also on other software assignments. So one of the key aspects of domain names is to make sure you know who the key holder is and to get the passwords before any employees are made redundant. In addition, for social media logins and passwords, it's often helpful to get them at the same time, as these can often hold value for a purchaser. Although in our experience, we've never erred on the side of putting them in a legal document. We would consider them to be brand enhancing features and could be passed over post sale rather than putting them in the SPA. So as I mentioned earlier, it's important not to show or provide the software in any way. Clearly that's the key asset. Parties are likely to ask for that with due diligence. But there are software programs that can read code faster than a human eye. And so we wouldn't advise providing the code for them to see. One of the ways you can get around that is to provide them with snips of code that are standard. So not the special parts of the algorithm that make this software asset its particular specialty. So parties can see the quality of the code, and they can usually see what types of cleansing they might need to do, or what types of developers they would need to take this forward. For instance, if there's a lot of redundancies in the code, then you would be able to see that from a fairly standard piece, and that would be something that a purchaser might want to know. So 5 key takeaways for your next case. So first off, given that we're talking about software, it's important to understand lapse dates of things like domain names, even patents or trademarks, designs, anything that's registered. It's important to know when the fatal deadline is. And as well as that, it's important to understand hosting fees, partially from an ongoing liability issue, but also because a purchaser may often ask how much it costs to host that and where they're hosting it currently, because that can make a difference if it's all on the same system for them. Secondly, it's important to clearly gather as much information as possible. The more information that you have, the better the ability to sell the assets for as high a price as possible. Thirdly, Keep thinking about what the purchaser's requirements are. If it's a PLC, for example, it's going to take more time to get them through the board and to get approvals to buy the assets. If it's a high net worth individual, for instance, they might be able to make more instant decisions. Fourthly, pinpoint who holds the key to the IP assets early on. If it's software, it's going to be the IT manager who might know something about it, or a key developer or lead developer may also know something that would be particularly interesting for a purchaser to know. And if in doubt, look at our checklist for pointers and give us a call.
Ta-da!
As if by magic.
So we can send, I think we sent this around after the first webinar, but if anyone hasn't got this link and wants it, then let us know. We can send this to you. It's a checklist that you can run through on your assignments to see if there's potentially any value. It's not exhaustive, but it might give you a few pointers of assets to look for. So before we wrap up, we've had a few questions which has impressed me over the piece of software that we're running to use this webinar. So I'll read those out and we can have a shot between us of answering those. So the first one is, can you give any guidance regarding costs? Which step in the process incur the greatest cost? I guess if you're talking about our Metis Partners process, we run on a fixed fee and percentage of uplift or percentage of the return basis. So, but in terms of our time costs, if we were to do it on that basis, typically the information gathering and creation of the documentation thereafter would take the longest, with the market research tied into that taking probably about the same amount of time. So we spend a lot of time understanding who the likely bidders are going to be, and that's where I think we probably add most value in terms of, well, first identifying them, but then who the most likely buyers in that particular area. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's usually the competitors, other people that know the space that are going to see most value in them. Also, the people who have the stakeholders, whether that be shareholders, ex-directors. We've had a number of cases where we sold assets back to previous owners who have on-sold the business and then it's failed, and we sold the assets back to previous owners. Have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it depends on, the cost for us also depends on what type of process you run. I think whilst we spend a lot of time on the start of the processes and that said, it can also depend on if there's a big uptick in the number of purchasers or interested parties that want to purchase the assets, then we'll spend quite a while on due diligence inquiries and making sure that everybody gets the same level of information so that they're all in a level playing field. So it can depend a bit on what exactly the assets are and how it happens, and where we spend our time costs as well.
The second question is, can you offer any guidance on the average time to execute? Another good question. I'm kind of process driven. Typically, it depends. Well, again, it's how long is a piece of string in terms of the asset. If the asset is patent backed, you typically want a longer period of time. In the M&A field, you probably want 12 to 24 months. Obviously, that's not feasible in insolvency. We typically recommend sort of 3 to 4 months for a patent-backed sale. If you don't sell it on day one, other sales that we run have been from anything as short as 3 to 4 days. If it's kind of an asset that's a bit easier to understand, a brand or something that can be communicated pretty quickly. Typical timeframes for us, 4 to 6 weeks. That kind of gives us enough time to gather the information, get the information to market. So it's quite a nice trade-off between time and getting the best return for the assets. The last question is, what issues cause most deals to fall through? Have you got any?
If sometimes things can come out of the woodwork, but that could be anything. I think it's helpful to think about, rather than what caused most deals to fall through, rather to think about how you can mitigate any fallout from any damage. So whilst there might be a small price chip, then that might be worth it for the insolvency practitioner, depending on what's happened in the context of the case. But also sometimes what is helpful is to think about how your relationship with the purchaser is. As we mentioned earlier, it's important that you have a good relationship with the purchaser so that you can call them up and, if they've got a little wiggle about something, then you can usually hopefully provide some comfort as to why that's happened and how you can help to pull that for them.
I think that's right, and the only thing I'd add to that is that we barely have deals that fall through completely. It tends to be more price chip, and where we have had deals fall through completely, it's actually been where assets have been accidentally sold by the insolvency practitioner, and that has devalued the rest of the IP assets. So that's actually something to look out for, is make sure that when you're selling physical assets, perhaps through another agent, you're not selling the intellectual property. And some buyers of the physical assets might try and be a bit fly and add in that they want to buy the IP, even though it's not really part of the sale. And we've seen that happen a couple of times and trip things up. But apart from that, usually you can save things and make a deal happen. Okay, right, that's the end of the questions. Thanks very much for attending again. We'll be back in the new year with a session on valuing intellectual property assets for a number of purposes, pre-packs to inform you of the value of IP before you start a sales process, and a number of different reasons why you'd want to get an IP asset valuation in distress. So we'll be back in 2017 with that. Have a fabulous Christmas and New Year, and yeah, we'll see you in 2017.
Thanks very much, guys.